Hello, everybody. My name is Jonathan Fisher from Cascade Rail Foundation, and today we have another in a series of historic programs by our friend Alan Miller. Today, Alan will be taking us on a tour of the Milwaukee Road Everett Branch. So sit back, grab your popcorn, and we're in for a very interesting program. George and I are going to mute and turn our cameras off, and I'll turn it over to Alan to say a couple of things, and then we'll go from there.
All right, thank you for that introduction. I hope I can live up to that. So we'll just, without any further ado, we'll get started on this long trek. Program today is about the Milwaukee Road's Everett line. It was a 55-mile branch coming off the main line at Cedar Falls and running down the upper and lower Snoqualmie valleys to Monroe, and then down the Snohomish Valley to the city of Everett, Washington. And my connection was that I grew up along the line in the towns of Carnation and Duval. Hung around the railroad tracks a lot when I was a teenager. And then later as an employee, I was the last operator to work at Everett Depot and copied the train orders for the Everett Local's final run. Moncton, April 1910. And Milwaukee Road is in the process of finishing up a branch line to Enumclaw, and now they're constructing a branch line down to Everett. So with these branches sending traffic up here, they're going to need more track capacity. So what we're seeing here is a work train with a K1 class Prairie engine 2092, and he's got several cars of gravel here. This probably came from the company pit up at Ragnar, a ways up the line. And he's coming down here with that. They're going to use it for fill to build a new yard that they're putting in here. Now, the tank cars over here, the Milwaukee at the same time was transitioning from coal to oil for fuel for their locomotives. And so until a permanent pumping plant can be built here, they're pumping bunker C oil directly out of these tank cars. And then over here, we can see that the grade is in for the Everett Branch. So they're actively constructing on it right now. This railroad over here was known as the Weeks Logging Road, but it was the North Bend Lumber Company, and their railroad was known as the North Bend and Eastern, the NB&E. And they ran a line up here from their mill in Edgewick so that they could ship finished product, lumber and shingles over the Milwaukee. And they also had a similar line to the NP at Tanner so they could ship on either road. Now, when the Everett line gets put in, they'll reconfigure this switch here and they'll hook into the Everett line rather than where their connection is now. And they had this little X New York City elevated steam engine that they used for that purpose. And this isn't a very good picture of it, but it looks like the engineers hauling the ladies down to North Bend for a shopping trip. But later in 1911, when more people had settled in Moncton, they would use this engine on Saturday nights and get an empty boxcar and put some long benches in it, and then put some hay burner lanterns in there for light. And they would haul people from Camp 2 clear up at the Cedar Lake Dam and from Moncton and haul them all down to North Bend. And this was all arranged by Mr. Vintage, one of the owners of the company. And they would go to these Masonic dances that they would have down in North Bend on Saturday nights. And the transportation was all free. You just had to pay for a ticket at the door to get into the dance. And then the dance was over around 1 a.m. And then everybody would load back into the boxcar and they'd bring them all back home and get them all back home by around 2 o'clock in the morning. So that was a really form of entertainment in the area. Here's a letterhead from the company. And we see William C. Weeks was the source for the nickname Weeks Logging Road. And then Robert Webb Vintage was the other partner. And these two men founded the North Bend Lumber Company. And this letter is concerning an overhead bridge of theirs over the main line of the Milwaukee Road about a mile east of Cedar Falls. And it was on a spur line that they had already logged those stands of timber. And so they weren't using this spur anymore. And it's August 1918. The Milwaukee Road is preparing to electrify its main line. So they would like to have this overhead bridge removed. And the logging company had no objections to taking it down for them. And this is the bridge in question, FF 118.5. And I believe that's Washington Mountain there in the background. And now back up at Moncton again. And we see now they put in the switch for the Everett line. So they're now starting to actively lay rail on that branch. And we see the carloads of bunker sea oil still. Back here is the bunkhouse and the beanery. And later on, those will be rebuilt right alongside the Everett Branch. And this gentleman here is Charles L. Stewart, and he is a conductor pilot on the helpers at this point. But later, when the Everett line gets up and running, then Charlie will take a position as conductor on the Everett line passenger train. And then this is his wife, Hattie, and she was the postmistress up here at Moncton. This is down in Cherry Valley, and this is the Milwaukee Road Survey Camp. And they're out here surveying out the line and setting stakes. And there was an article in the August 13th, 1909 edition of the Monroe Monitor newspaper that said a bill of lumber was sold to the Milwaukee Road by the Johnson Yard on an order signed by E. Simpson, locating engineer, for use in building drafting tables at their camp near Cherry Valley. And in the lower valley, the Milwaukee's line followed the banks of the Snoqualmie River very closely. So the easiest way to get around there was with a boat. So here's their surveyor's boat that they used down there. There was also another little blurb in the Monroe paper in February 1910 that said that the Milwaukee surveyors had gotten all of the roads full of stakes and now they were putting them in the river. And here's their boat, and we can zoom in and see the name of the boat was the Alice. Not that that means anything. And this is Duval, and this is late 1910 or very early 1911, and the contractor for the Milwaukee is using this little dinky locomotive and some dump cars on narrow gauge tracks, and they're excavating an embankment behind the photographer here, and he's hauling that fill out here to form a foundation for the Duval yards and the depot for the Milwaukee. And the Great Northern is already in. They've got their rails down. They've got cars on the passing track. This is their depot here. And then this town evolved from the village of Cherry Valley, which was just a ways behind where the photographer is taking this picture from. And those buildings were in the way of the two railroads. So they platted out a town site up here and moved those buildings up here. And this eventually became the town of Duval. And you can see they got wooden sidewalks and muddy streets. And here's the actual excavation in progress. This outfit was owned by a guy out of Everett named O.C. Wolf. And the Great Northern has already excavated a cut over here. So now this contractor is going to take all the rest of this fill out of here. And as we saw, they're using some of it for the Duval yards, but a big portion of this is going to go north of here and put the Milwaukee's branch on a fill almost all the way out to Cherry Creek. And this is a screen grab from a video, but it says track laying on CM and STP Railroad Duval. But it's actually, they're laying down more narrow gauge track, because when you do fill operations from rail cars, you have to constantly keep moving the tracks over. And we see the same operation going on in Monroe in 1910. Steam shovel for excavation, dinky narrow gauge locomotive and dump cars. And the contractors that built the Everett Branch, wherever they could get heavy equipment shipped in, they would work from that point. And so they built the Everett line from several different points rather than working off of a steadily advancing railhead. And here we see Snohomish, 1910. And this contractor is moving his operations from the west side of Snohomish to the east side. And so he's laying down track in front of these locomotives and then picking the track up behind them. And this was a contractor out of Spokane that was named Q and Silk. And so that's the CNS on the boiler there. And Lee Pickett took this photo and he labeled it First Milwaukee Train Through Snohomish. And when I lived in Snohomish, I was approached by a couple of different writers that wanted to know if this really was the Milwaukee Road's railroad through Snohomish. But of course, it's not. It's just a contractor moving to another job site. And the Moncton was a helper point on the Milwaukee Road at the foot of the mountain grade. So it was mainly just employees in this town at this time. So they just had this little 12 by 32 foot class D2 depot for facilities up here. So now that they're going to have a couple branch lines coming in here, there's going to be more of the public passing through here and using their station. So they had a need for a new, bigger depot here. So in the fall of 1911, they built this structure. And it had separate men's and women's waiting rooms, and it had interior restrooms, and then it had this open air waiting room on the end of it. And a few months later, in the spring of 1912, the city convinced the Milwaukee Road to change the name of this station from Moncton to Cedar Falls because they had a hydroelectric plant on the Cedar River that they called the Cedar Falls plant. So they made the Milwaukee an offer they couldn't refuse. They erected these signs on each end of the depot that spelled out the station name in light bulbs. And then they supplied electricity to the depot and to the company houses. And then they put a feather in their own cap and put this sign up behind the depot: the Municipal Light and Power Plant of Seattle, America's best lighted city, 40 miles. And this is the first employee timetable issued when the line was open for service. And although there was some tri-weekly freight service during the construction period, as early as August 1911, regular freight service didn't start until here with the opening of the line on November 12th, 1911. And looking at some of the stations on here, Falls City with an S was a commonly reoccurring misspelling of that town. But down here we have Duval with just one L, even though the depot had a sign on the end of it that said they had two L's on it. And so that spelling error was not corrected in the timetables until June of 1925. And I have train orders as late as 1929 that still misspell it. And you'll see a lot of Great Northern Railway crossings along the route. Only two of those were crossings of the two roads main line. And that was here at Stillwater, and then this one down at High Rock. The Milwaukee and the Lower Valley put their railroad between the Great Northern Branch and the Snoqualmie River. And so the Great Northern had spurs going into several mills down in the valley. And so the Milwaukee line had to cross those Great Northern spurs at grade. So that's what these other Great Northern crossings are. And regarding freight service on the line, there was a scheduled way freight in each direction, numbers 97 and 98, daily except Sunday, with the meeting point being at Monroe. But by May of 1916, the meeting point had been moved to Duval. And then in May of 1931, the Everett local was combined with the Enumclaw local, and the meeting point was changed to Stillwater. And between September 1919 and May of 1920, during the USRA takeover, the way freights, which by then were numbered 295 and 296, one of those tied up in the Great Northern Delta Yard in Everett, and the other one tied up here in North Bend. And during that time frame, a second trick operator was put on the depot at North Bend, and his name was William H. Kellogg, and that made the depot's hours from 7 a.m. to 11 p.m. And the lower Snoqualmie Valley and Snohomish valleys were prone to flooding. So the Milwaukee Road wanted to get their branch line up above flood level. So a lot of the line through the valley was built on temporary trestle. And temporary trestle has 3 piles to a bent, whereas permanent trestle has 5 pile bents. So when they come to like a cattle pass or a stream, they would build a permanent trestle there with bulkheads on each end of it. And then later work trains would come down and with gravel and fill in those temporary trestles. So because they had so much line on fill, they wanted to give that chance to settle before they put passenger trains on. So the passenger service wasn't inaugurated until April 21st, 1912. And they had a round trip train out of Cedar Falls to Everett and back. But they also had this shuttle service that was in competition with the Everett Snohomish Interurban. And it was several round trips a day, with about half the trips would terminate at Snohomish and then return back to Everett, and the other trips went through to Monroe. And it was a kind of a commuter service, but initially what was dubbed the Everett Express, trains 117 and 118 made a single round trip from Cedar Falls to Everett and return, connecting with the westbound Columbian passenger train on the main line, train number 17, and the morning passenger train from Enumclaw, which then that train ran to Seattle. In the evening, it arrived in time for passengers to connect with the eastbound Columbian train number 18 and the Enumclaw passenger train returning from Seattle. And when the Enumclaw and Everett line passenger trains would arrive in Cedar Falls at the same time, so they would exchange passengers, and then they would go down to the Cedar Falls Y and turn their trains and then run back to their respective terminals. By January of 1913, the Everett line passenger train was tying up at North Bend. And since the agent at North Bend was named Sam Morris, the morning train to Cedar Falls, number 142, was dubbed the Morris Special. And the return train, 141, the North Bend Local. And the trains were renumbered to 217 and 218 in June of 1913. And the steam engine was replaced with a gas electric motor car in November of that year. And a Y track was built at North Bend to turn the car. Now, it was combined with the Enumclaw passenger train in December of 1914, with the train tying up at Enumclaw each evening, arriving there at 10 p.m. And then the Enumclaw passenger train was abolished in November of 1915, and the Everett passenger train now made a round trip to Seattle from Everett. What they called double daily service was added in May of 1916, with one train each making round trips out of Seattle and Everett. On September 1st, 1920, steam service was reinstated because now the gas electric motor cars were being outfitted as trolley troubleshooters for the new electrification on the main line. And between April 1926 and June 1929, the passenger train would lay over at Snoqualmie Falls from mid-morning until late afternoon. And while the train was laying over there, conductor C.F. Wilder, he built himself a fine boat. And he used steam from the locomotive to bend the boards around the bow. And the final run came on August 30th, 1930. And the passenger train was replaced the following day by an 8-cylinder, 16-passenger Studebaker bus costing $16,000. And it also carried the mail. And it was driven by Vernon Keene, the son of late engineer Bill Keene. And when laying over at Cedar Falls, it was parked in that under that porch on the end of the depot. And this is just special instructions out of the timetable, but it shows there was a pair of drawbridges on the Everett line, one over the Snohomish River at Lowell and one over Eby Slough. And then Meadowbrook, it shows it's 2.5 miles west of North Bend. But by September of 1913, it had been relocated to 1.6 miles west of North Bend. And so I don't know what was at the former location, but when they relocated, I know that that was a bulk oil plant. And I think it was both Union Oil and Standard. And here we are in the Cedar Falls yard. There's the steel service tank that sat atop the brick pedestal that's still up there. But this is February 17th, 1913, and we're looking at the Everett Express. And the crew here is that's Gene Hill, conductor, and George Lyons, and Ray Cook, fireman, and Bill Jones, engineer, and then William Emerson was a traveling engineer. And taking a sneak look here, we see they got a Tacoma Eastern mail and express car. And then they got a combination baggage and a smoker, and then a coach. And so I guess that was your typical branch line consist. And this locomotive, the 2130, was a class G4S, and it was built by Grant in 1888 as the 747, and then it was renumbered 122 in 1899 and to the 2130 in 1912. And then later it became Puget Sound and Willapa Harbor number 4 from July 1914 until November 1920. And then it was scrapped in November of 1927. And here's the shuttle service down in Monroe. And let's take a closer look at that locomotive. You can see it's been fitted up with a pilot and a headlight on the rear of the tender. And that's because to return back to Everett now, he'll run around this coach and couple onto the other end of it and then haul it back to Everett by running the engine backwards. And they've already put the marker lamps on what's going to be the rear of that coach. And then if we jump over on this end here, I can see there's a diamond-shaped Wells Fargo Express sign on the bay window of the depot. And then over here is your standard Milwaukee Road switch target. And this one's got a single tie stand. It's a cast stand that's meant to spike down to a single tie. There was only about 2 of those left in service when I worked for the Milwaukee. Now, 3 days after they inaugurated the passenger service, they chartered an excursion up to North Bend and Snoqualmie Falls. And this was chartered by the commercial clubs of Everett, Snohomish, and Monroe. They called it the Get Acquainted Excursion because of the stations on this new Milwaukee Road branch. They thought this would be a good opportunity for everyone in those little towns to get to know each other. So they chartered this excursion, and the fare from Everett, which was the furthest point, was $2, and it included your lunch. And then they total from all the little towns along there, they had a total of 479 passengers in 5 coaches. So here we see the Snohomish contingent out here in front of the Milwaukee Depot. And this building was Wilbur Drug Company. And Milwaukee Road acquired this building when they bought the right-of-way through here. And so they turned it into what was supposed to be a temporary depot, but like a lot of Milwaukee projects, it never was completed. And so it served as a depot here the whole time the Milwaukee was in town. And here's another Wells Fargo Express sign on it. And you'll see the white tags on the men's coats here. Each town was encouraged to come up with a slogan for this excursion. And so Snohomish's slogan was, you can't miss Snohomish if you come over to Milwaukee. And so here we see the excursion train climbing Tolt Hill. And then here's the excursion train at the North Bend water tank. And then this was taken from the water tank, looking down on the excursionists in the train and the depot. And they've cut the 5 coaches off on the main line here, and then they went up to Cedar Falls with the engine and the 2 baggage cars. And they're going to turn them on the Y, and then when they come back down, they'll come down the passing track here and then couple onto what was the rear of the train to take it back. And the passengers here had about an hour and 40 minutes to kill while that took place. So there was a nearby school here, so they got some of the boys from the school and challenged them to a baseball game, and then they held some races and some other entertainment. And then some of them wandered up to the town of North Bend and converged on the eating establishments and reportedly almost drank the town dry. Now they ate their lunch at where there was a trail that went down to Snoqualmie Falls, and some of the group made that hike down to see the falls. But it was kind of a miserable trip because it seemed to rain every time they stopped the train for any station. The rain would start up. But this is the return trip, and we're at Monroe, at the Monroe water tank. And you see it was engine 122. And this is the same locomotive as the 2130 that we saw in the Cedar Falls yard. And they detrained enough passengers that they were able to set out an empty coach. And then in the background, we can see the Monroe Depot and the Wells Fargo sign on the bay, the train order signal. And then way in the back is the Pacific Coast Condensed Milk Company. And the passengers toured that facility while they were laid over here. Now back up to North Bend. This is the North Bend Depot when it was brand new. In fact, it's so new that they haven't even put the train order signal up on it yet. But North Bend was opened as a station in March of 1911 out of a boxcar depot. And this depot was completed about June or July of 1911. And the first agent here was a guy named E.C. Carr. And then he resigned. So a guy who would later be the Monroe agent, Crawford Gordon, came in here off the extra board and filled in until the job was rebid. And then the bidder was a guy named Seward S. Morris, and he went by the name Sam. And he was the agent here for the duration. North Bend was closed in May of 1927. And then the depot was converted to a section dwelling in the 1930s. And then was eventually raised in August of 1975. But the agent's wife here, Ingar, because she was the wife of a railroad employee, she had a pass to ride on the trains for free. So she was envied by a lot of women up here in North Bend because she would take this gas electric car down to Seattle quite often. And when she did, she usually had a lot of orders from other women up here in North Bend to pick up things for them. And this car emitted exhaust fumes apparently because when she would ride it, she would get sick from the exhaust fumes on this car. But she needed stuff in Seattle. She kept on it. But here's the depot not too long before it was torn down. And this extension on the bay window here was a phone booth. And they had a city phone in there so that the train crew could get a hold of the train dispatcher if they needed to for any reason. And so if you're detail oriented, the phone number for that phone that was in that booth was area code 206-888-0282. All right, this is looking at North Bend from the other direction. And there's the water tank depot, then that school. And they adopted the colors of orange and maroon for their school colors because of Milwaukee Road's presence here. And then you'll notice two handcar houses. And that's because there was two sections out of here. They had a section A1 that worked the territory from here almost up to Cedar Falls, and then section A2 almost down to Falls City. And then we had a little bit of trouble up here in February of 1923. They had a terrible snowstorm. And so I'm guessing that on the night of February 13th, the Everett Express coming down from Cedar Falls, the storm was so bad that they sidetracked him here to wait out the storm. And North Bend is famous for its winds. So while he was in the sidetrack there on the passing track, the wind drifted him in. And this is 2 days later on February 15th, 1923, and they're trying to dig this frozen locomotive out of the icy grave. Even the cab was filled with drifted snow. But they eventually got him out. But this locomotive here, the 6000, has an interesting history. It was, excuse me, but it was built as number 796 by Schenectady as a 10-wheeler, 460, in April of 1889. And it was kind of an experimental engine. It had an unusually large firebox, which caused the rear driver bearings to overheat. So to solve this problem, a set of trailing wheels were installed under the cab to carry some of the weight. But then this converted it to a Pacific class, 462, and the first of its kind. And when the Milwaukee Road developed a classification system for its locomotives in 1899, this locomotive became a class F1. and it was renumbered 191, and then to the 850 in 1904, to 1500 in 1905, and then to the 6000 in 1912. And then later it was rebuilt back to a 10-wheeler in January of 1926 and designated as a Class G4G 460 and numbered 2185. But it remained in passenger service on the Everett line and was actually the locomotive on the last run on August 30th, 1930. And then the 2185 was scrapped that following December. And conductor C.F. Wilder took some photos of the last train at the Everett Depot before departure, but those photos have failed to surface. But they got the train out, but then they had to bring down a rotary snowplow from Cedar Falls to plow out the main line. And then they had a deja vu moment 27 years later when the Everett local with Malley number 50 got stuck in a snowdrift up here on February the 4th, 1950. And fireman Red Griffin said that he felt that if Art Holden had just plowed through this thing, he could have done it. But Art shut the throttle down, and then he ended up getting stuck in this drift, and they had to bring a bulldozer down here to get him free. And a little ways out of North Bend was this covered bridge, FF 822, and it was a 100-foot howe truss covering over the South Fork of the Snoqualmie River. And I took this photo on November 13th, 1972, because it was about to be replaced. You can see the steel components off to the side in there. And this bridge was built in 1911, and the bridge that's going to replace it dates back to the 1890s because it came off of some abandoned branch line in Wisconsin somewhere. And this is down at the Snoqualmie Falls Mill, and they established a station down here in November of 1916 with this little boxcar depot and named it Snoqualmie. And this picture was taken on January the 9th, 1917, but they're in the process of building a permanent depot here. And so here we see the depot under construction over here, and then the boxcar depot here. But the location was called, well, it was Snoqualmie Falls Lumber Company's mill here. And then nearby, they were building a company town that they were going to call Snoqualmie Falls to differentiate between the town of Snoqualmie over on the other side of the river. So then in August of 1917, the Milwaukee changed the name of this station from Snoqualmie to Snoqualmie Falls. And so here we see the depot in later years. And it got rather shabby and run down and actually became an embarrassment to the Weyerhaeuser people. And one time they had some high-level people coming from the corporate offices to tour the mill. And Milwaukee Road Chief Carpenter T.M. Pajari had to make a flying trip up here and put a Milwaukee logo on the side of the building so that these people coming on this tour would not mistake this for a Weyerhaeuser building, because they kept all their buildings in pretty good looking shape. And so this building was eventually replaced in 1962 with a 10-foot by 36-foot portable. And then the agency up here was closed out in June of 1974. And then a couple of years later, on October 13th, 1976, they loaded that building on a flat car and hauled it down to Maytown to be the office for the section foreman down there. And it's still down there, as far as I know, unless Rainier Rail has demolished it. And this is Tokel. And Tokel was established as a station in June of 1912. But this was a jumping off point for Snoqualmie Falls. There was a trail about 3/4 of a mile long that went down to the falls from here. And they started running a lot of excursion trains up here for people that wanted to see the falls. And so then on September 28, 1913, Milwaukee Road changed the name of this station from Tokel to Snoqualmie Falls. And we see some railroad employees here that have borrowed a hand car, probably on a Sunday afternoon, and come up here for a picnic and to see the falls, probably. But excursions were quite popular for a while. And this is from the June 1st edition of the Snohomish Tribune. And it shows a excursion that's going to be run on the 8th. And then here's an excursion at North Bend. This was the Machinist Picnic, run on June 23rd, 1912. And it must have been well attended because, man, that's a lot of cars on that train. But because of them having to change the name of Snoqualmie to Snoqualmie Falls down at the mill, they had to rename this back to Tokel. So that happened on August 5th, 1917. And then here we see the Tokel siding has been pulled up, and now they're starting to tear up the main line. And this is in September 1975 when they were tearing up the abandoned Everett line. And the first thing they did was come up here and unbolt all these rails. And then they measured them and they put the white center marks on them so that they could pick them up and put them on the bed of semi trucks to haul them out of here. And this is a spectacular little bridge just a short ways away. This is the Tokel Creek Viaduct, Bridge FF 842. That was a 25 span timber trestle that was 132 feet high. And we see it under construction in this photo and again in this photo. And in this one, if we zoom in, we can see the workers busily working away, and there's guys down here in the timbers. And then here's the finished product. And as built, it has a 32-foot wooden truss over Tokel Creek. But a couple of years later, they put in this 70-foot A steel girder. And I suspect that was to get a couple of vents away from the edge of Tokel Creek, where it would be prone to being washed out, and a lot of it is. You see a lot of wood chip cars on this train. Wood chip traffic was real heavy on the Everett local. They got wood chips from the Snoqualmie Falls mill, and they also got them from the White River mill down in Enumclaw. And they all went to Everett for Weyerhaeuser Mill A and the Craft Mill. And a little ways further down the line is Falls City. And they had a 980-foot long passing track here that was used on occasion, like with the pasture train would meet the way freight, they would duck in here to let them by. And they had a section crew here. So they had a car house down here. And then they had a couple of bunkhouses, and a 12 by 36 foot was probably the section foreman's quarters, and then a 12 by 28 for the laborers, and then they had a 5 by 5 water closet, and then they had a telephone in a box on a pole here so they could get their lineups and talk to the dispatcher if need be. And then there was an 8 by 16 foot milk platform here because a lot of farmers would ship their milk to Monroe to the condensery. And then there was a 12 by 36 foot depot. And this depot building came from Ketchlis. When they opened the tunnel line in January 1915, they closed the depot at Ketchlis and then abolished that station. And so in August of that year, they loaded this thing on a flat car and hauled it down here to Falls City and set it off here. And they had an agent in here for a short time. And then there was an umbrella shed here that they then moved it to the new Ketchlis out at the Roaring Creek water tank. So they just kind of swapped buildings. And a little ways down the line from Falls City was a station called Galvers, and it was located near milepost 18, and they had a 927-foot passing track with a logging road going off of it. And they shipped logs out of there from 1924 to 1933, but I don't know much about them. But this is a little further down from there, and this is Bridge FF 852 over Griffin Creek. And we got a similar situation here, a side track with a logging road going off of it. But you'll see, notice here, J.I. Horrocks Spur. Now, John Irvin Horrocks was the superintendent in charge of the Snoqualmie Tunnel project, and he was an engineer for the Milwaukee Road. But a short time later, he started his own contracting company out of Seattle. But he had a farm up here in Carnation, and so he had this spur put in to put where he could store his contracting equipment. And but the main purpose of this map is Grover Lazarus started the Lazarus Logging Company here, and he had a logging road that went up Griffin Creek, and he had a mill up there. So the Milwaukee put in this siding where they could set out empty cars for him, and he'd come down and get them, take them up to his mill, and then bring the loads back down here. And here's a picture of his mill up there. I think this was mainly a tie mill, but he may have cut dimensional lumber also. But here's his little Shay locomotive, and then a bunch of employees on the flat car. And he worked out of here from 1919 until 1924. And then he got out of the sawmill business and he just started shipping logs. So he established another connection down at Carnation from 1924 to 29. And then he moved to Duval and shipped logs out of there from 1929 until 1931 or 32 when he went broke. And this is the Tolt River Bridge, and this is Bridge FF 856, and it was two 125-foot howe truss spans with one panel and a skew. But this is a good example of how the Milwaukee Road covered their bridges in the early days. They just boxed in the trusses themselves. It wasn't until the mid-1930s that they covered the whole bridge with a big barn-like covering. What's going on here? This is either late 1924 or early 1925. Cherry Valley Logging Company is moving their operations from Stillwater to a new logging operation up on Griffin Creek. And these bunk cars were too wide to fit through the howe trusses, so they built a temporary shoe fly around the bridge to get their cars to their camp. And this is the same bridge with the full covering on it. And there's two stories on this bridge. One says that it caught fire and burned up, and the other said it was heavily damaged by flood. But in either case, fire or water, it was replaced with steel spans, which are still there. This is a part of the Snoqualmie Valley Rail Trail. And this is down the station of Carnation. In the distance, we're looking at the passing track, and then this was the house track. And any photos of the Carnation Depot in operation are non-existent, really. So here's about the best we can do. And Tolt Depot was closed in 1949, and then they sold the building in 1954. And a fellow bought it and moved it a couple blocks down Whistle Street and made a home out of it. And it's getting harder to recognize because now they put a big addition on the back of it. But this depot is pretty closely identical to the one in Duval. And Stillwater was the site of the largest logging outfit in the valley, Cherry Valley Logging Company. Started out as Stillwater Logging, and they had a log dump on the Snoqualmie River. And then the mainline railroads built down through the valley, and the Everett Cherry Valley Traction Company, or the Great Northern, here and in the Milwaukee here, and all three of them converged on the same spot and formed a kind of a triangle between the three railroads. And for facilities, the Milwaukee Road had a telephone booth here, and then they put in a 9 by 10 Class C telegraph office. And then Great Northern had a 10 by 16 pasture shelter with a 90-foot cinder platform. And this connection and this one here were put in during the construction period. Great Northern had their rails down already, so the contractors used Great Northern to ship in materials like rails and timbers and stuff that they would need to build the Milwaukee line. So they could interchange them to this logging railroad and then get them down to the Milwaukee through this connection. Now, in 1913, Cherry Valley wanted to start shipping their logs by rail. So they put that connection in and used this, what they called the river track, for the storage of empty log flats. And then they put the loads in this new siding that the Milwaukee built that was 2,009 feet long. And a short time after this was all set up, these two trestles here on the logging line started to get in bad shape. So in September 1914, the Milwaukee put in this connection, and so they could come out that way to deliver their logs. And so then the Cherry Valley Logging Company had running rights over the Milwaukee's Everett line from there down to this trestle on the other end of the siding. And that was kind of the reason for the phone here, so they could call and make sure the line was clear. But this was all yard limits through here, so trains of all classes were restricted to 6 miles an hour through here to expect log trains on the main track at any time. They ran a special train called the Stillwater Logger to handle this business, and they would come in and they would cut their caboose off here somewhere and then pull by and then shove all the empties out on the river track and then go put the caboose on the rear of the log string and then go down the other end and couple on, and they would haul them to a log dump called Riverview that was 2 miles below Snohomish. And then from there, they were made up into rafts and towed by paddle wheel river boats down to the Weyerhaeuser mill in Everett. And here we see a transfer of logs taking place. The Cherry Valley's 101, this was their biggest power, has tacked on the Milwaukee's caboose onto the end of the log string. And we can see conductor Frank Sullivan up on the roof of his caboose. And that's the 01199. Now, once they pull out of here, then Cherry Valley will back down here and couple onto these empty log flats, take them back up in the woods for reloading. And this is a Darius Kinsey photo, and it was taken in 1918, and he was over on the river track is where he took it from. And I just happened to have a train order addressed to Frank Sullivan. I should say I have part of a train order. I found this up in the attic of the Everett Depot when I worked there, and unfortunately the roof leaked, and so it kind of ruined part of the train order. But this was copied at Everett in October 1913. And at that time, the Milwaukee Road addressed their train orders to the conductor instead of to engine numbers. So it's addressed to Sullivan, an engineer, run extra Everett to Cedar Falls. And then 12 means, do you understand? And then the conductor signs 13, I understand. Sullivan, conductor, and engineer Gibbs. And here's the log dump down at Riverview. And the entire sidetrack down here from switch to switch was 2,888 feet long. And then the trestle portion of it that was out over the river itself, that was 1,252 feet long, and it was designated as Bridge FF 998 1/4, and it was 81 spans of trestle work there. And then we zoom in here. There's a 9-span spur track here that was designated as Bridge FF 998 1/4 A, and it was 239 feet long and held 3 cars. And the purpose of it was that they were also shipping cedar piling and telegraph poles along with the log shipments. And they didn't want to get those mixed in with the logs that were going down to the Weyerhaeuser mill. So the spur was a place where they could set those cars off to the side and then deal with them later. Now, the yellow portion here is the actual log dump, and it extended from spans 15 to 47 on the trestle work out there. And this was double track because there was a derrick that ran on another track alongside it, the cars, and then would unload the logs as it progressed. And then you'll notice that there's another railroad in here, and that's the Northern Pacific's Everett Branch, but it's being leased by the Everett Snohomish Interurban. So this line is electrified. And then there was a county road that wandered down here between the two railroads, and then they crossed on a rickety old bridge here. But here's a panoramic view of the log dump. And there's that rickety bridge I spoke of. And then there's the Everett Snohomish Interurban's tracks there. You can see the trolley hangers on the pole. And then that kind of looks like it's a schoolhouse with a little bell tower on it. But the log cars, you can see, are Tacoma Eastern. And the Milwaukee Road had a whole fleet of these type of log flats, and they would put what they called turtleback bunks on these flatbed decks for hauling logs on them, and then they'd lease them out to various logging companies. And so Cherry Valley leased cars rather than maintain their own fleet. And you can see the turtleback bunks on the decks of these empty cars that have been unloaded already. And then you can see that the dump is lighted because I'm sure in the winter months they were still out here dumping logs after dark. Here's the boom for the derrick, and he's about to unload this car right here. Now this structure here sat out a ways from the dump, and I think it was to contain these logs that when they would dump them into the river, that so they wouldn't drift out and then get caught in the current and be taken downstream. And if we go down to this end of the dump, we can see the Stillwater loggers locomotive and caboose down at this end. Now he's either going to wait for them to unload these cars and then haul them back empty back to Stillwater, or he's going to cut off and go caboose hop back to Stillwater and get more logs. But they dumped about 60 loads of logs a day off of this dump. Now, in late 1924, early 1925, Cherry Valley moved their operations up here on Griffin Creek to a bigger project. And this spur over here was originally put in 1912 for a company called Newton Packard. And then they were out of here by September of 1916. Then a company called Security Logging Company came in 1922 and used the same grade. And then now Cherry Valley has come in here and taken the whole thing over. And the Milwaukee Road put about 5,000 feet of track in here with a big long passing track and a secondary storage track. And I talked to old timers in Carnation that told me they would be sitting in the high school classroom and look out the window and see the train coming out of this siding with logs. And they would count the cars, and there would be 100 cars almost daily. And in fact, they set a log train record up here that I don't know if it was ever broken. On April 27th, 1927, Cherry Valley delivered 131 loads of logs to conductor E.A. Kittleson and engineer Ben Snyder. And they had the Malley 9609. And they went to Riverview, dumped the logs, and returned back here with 101 empties, all within 9 hours and 30 minutes. Now, the steam shuttle service that was between Everett and Snohomish and Monroe was replaced in January 1913 with a new gas electric motor car. And so they changed a whole new schedule. All the runs went all the way through to Monroe. In fact, the gas car tied up overnight at Monroe, whereas the steam train tied up in Everett. And they were pretty proud of this service. They even had two trains that they called theater trains. And so 211 would depart Monroe at 7:05 p.m. and get into Everett at 7:45. And then people could go uptown and see a production at the theater. And then the train would leave Everett at 11:15 p.m. and get back into Monroe just before midnight at 11:55. And here we see the brand new gas electric motor car at behind the depot in Everett. And I think this is January the 4th. And the car wasn't scheduled to go on regular service for a few days, but they wanted to make a test run to Monroe and back in this car. So they invited some prominent people to come, and you can see the white extra flags on here. It's not on a schedule, it's just a special run. And they had two of these cars. The 300 was on this shuttle service out of Everett, and then the 301 replaced the steam passenger train at Enumclaw. And both of them were center entrance cars. And they had built a Y at Monroe for turning this car. And when they got to Monroe and went to turn on the Y, the radius was too tight and the overhang demolished the switch dam. And so that forced this car to have to return back to Everett by running backwards. They couldn't get it turned. And the Julene studio produced these colored postcards of the car that they sold. And then here we see the car out on the trestle at Snohomish behind the Snohomish depot. And while I've got a good shot of it, the back part of this depot here was the freight room. And the ticket office, the waiting room, and everything was up in the front part on the street. So this was the doors that went into the freight room. And you can see a few cans of milk sitting here waiting to be shipped. This window here was for the telegraph office. They had a little office in there for, they had the telegraph instruments on it. But the station was opened in June of 1911 out of a boxcar depot originally until they got the building remodeled. And the agent that opened it here was a guy named Henry Thomas Price. And 2 days after he arrived here, he got a kind of a rude welcoming. He was at the Palm Saloon and he left there in the evening. They said that he was considerably under the weather, but he walked down this trestle work and went clear down to where the Northern Pacific crosses over the Milwaukee line. And he claimed he went down there to meet a freight train that he was expecting, but it was like 11 o'clock at night. I don't know what train he was expecting down there, but anyway, he went to sit down on the ties and two men jumped him from behind and beat him pretty severely and robbed him. In fact, he was in the hospital for a few days. And the Monroe agent, Ralph Cummings, made daily trips up here to handle the Snohomish business while he was recuperating. And he was a relay operator in the Chicago offices before he came here. And he did marry well, though. His wife was Catherine Keeley, who was the sister of Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul Vice President E.S. Keeley. And on May 17, 1913, VP Keeley came to Snohomish in his private car, the St. Paul, to visit his sister and brother-in-law. And then later, Price was able to convince the Milwaukee Road to name one of their passenger cars Snohomish. So he was a good booster for the town. And here we see the car again out at the depot. And this was the house track in here, and they had a ramp, a loading ramp there for that. And then they had a crossing watchman here, and this was his little shanty. And then over here, we had in April of 1920, they had a log train derailment here where a truss rod broke on a log car and caused a derailment. And a huge log that was 40 feet long and 8 feet in diameter came real close to going right through the front of this commercial hotel. And they had logs scattered all through here and tore up about 300 feet of track. And then this building was the Brun and Henry Stables, and it's, now it's converting over to automobile dealership. But they had their own spur into this building too. And in November of 1913, they converted the steam train, the steam passenger train on the Everett line, over to gas electric motor cars too, and eliminated the steam train. And so this is down at the Coronation Spur. That's on a Sunday evening, October the 4th, 1914. And the train has brought down a special shipment for Carnation Farms. This is the first shipment of purebred cattle to the farm, and it was 25 head of Holstein Friesian cattle. They were shipped out of Oconomowoc, Wisconsin, and they shipped them via Wells Fargo Express, so they shipped them down here in an express car. And we can see them unloading that car here. And this guy here looks to me like that could be Elbridge Stewart, the founder of the Carnation Company. I know he was down here during this event because, like I say, it was the first shipment of purebred cattle to the farm. And over here we have a milk platform, and the farm shipped their milk to their condensery in Monroe, and so they would bring a wagon or a truck up here and spot it alongside the building, and this end of it was all open, and they just huck the cans in there, and sometimes up to 200 cans of milk put in here. And then Milwaukee ran a milk car from Falls City down the line, and they would stop here and load these cans up, and then they would pick up more cans at other platforms along the way. And that all went to the condensery down in Monroe. And then in 1918, they had another event here at what now was the Stewart Spur, but they shipped in a champion milk cow, Sylvia Johanna, and then she had a calf that Elbridge Stewart wanted so badly that he bid $106,000 for it at an auction and became known as the highest priced bull in the world. And that was on June 7th, 1918. And they shipped them out here in a Chicago, Milwaukee, and Puget Sound refrigerator car. And so this was another big event at the farm. And here we see the champion milk cow there, and then her calf was King Sylvia. And then we look over here, we see that they filmed movie footage of this event. And I don't know what that, Jacobs maybe, Star Liberty Weekly. So this was footage that would be shown in movie theaters all over the country. And then you notice the Milwaukee Road's telegraph wires attached to a crossarm that's nailed up here above the cattle loading pen. And June 1917, the town of Tolt changed their name to Carnation to honor the Carnation farms that were becoming quite popular by then. So then that forced the railroad here to change this name from Carnation Spur. So they chose Stewart to honor Elbridge Amos Stewart, the founder of the Carnation Company. And Carnation Farms had their own private bridge across the Snoqualmie River so they could get to and from their spur. And from here, they shipped a lot of purebred cattle. And then they grew potatoes on the upper farm, and they shipped potatoes out of here, among other things. Another thing they shipped from here was manure to Monroe for the lettuce farms. And then inbound, they got things like hay and straw and beet pulp and other stuff for their farm. But these photos are from 1921, and the train hit a Riker gravel truck, and they were going to sue the railroad because they said there was poor visibility at this crossing, which I suspect was probably this milk platform. So they got my grandfather to come down and take pictures of it. But it was either settled out of court or just didn't go anywhere. And my grandpa ended up with the photos. And when I showed interest to him, he passed them on to me. But they loaded a lot of cattle out of here. And that's what they're doing here with these cars. And this ramp here was for trucks. They could go up and then they could back up and dump into gondola cars. And I think that's how they shipped a lot of that manure. And then you'll notice the Milwaukee Road has put extensions on their telegraph poles to get the wires up above to clear those trucks up on the ramp. And then here's their private bridge across the river. And then this down here was erosion control. They had a pile bulkhead here with planks on the riverside to prevent the current from washing out the embankment there. And they also shipped out of here purebred calves that they called fancy cattle. And they were sometimes shipped in these side door cabooses. And so the old 223 was one that was used on the Everett line for a number of years. And side door cabooses are kind of rare. And then on the Milwaukee center cupola cabooses are rare. But these calves, I don't know if they were in a pen or if they just put them in there, but they had an attendant. So they probably at least had a halter on them. And then here's the old 1451 was another side door caboose that was used on the Everett line. And then here we see conductor Don Andrews and Jimmy Kemp, and they're hamming it up here with caboose 0869. And this is on the Everett Logger. And the Everett Logger was a seasonal log train that was put on every year to handle logs from the mountain tree farm up at Cedar Falls. And here's a view out of the cupola of that same caboose. And on the Everett Logger, you can see all the empty log cars. And this is on the Great Northern coming into Monroe. And this, I think, is a dieselized version of the Everett Logger. I think this photo is taken at Monroe Junction. And when they had the Everett Logger on and then the Everett Local, there was the opportunity to have meets, usually at North Bend or Carnation. But the Logger was pulled off sometime in the early to mid 1960s. And this is the Duval Depot in May of 1912. And this station was opened October 8, 1911, out of a boxcar. And then this depot was opened in January 1912. And you can see the Wells Fargo Express signs on it. And then Continental Telegraph Company was a wholly owned subsidiary of the Milwaukee Road. And then you'll see Duval is correctly spelled on the depot, but not in the timetable. And the first agent there was a guy named, I'll go back to the depot. The first agent here was a guy named James Roy Lucas, and he came from the Tacoma Eastern, from Morton. He worked out of a boxcar depot at Glenavon until they got the Tacoma Eastern line finished into Morton. and then he became the Morton agent. And then a while later, he came out here to Duval and was the agent here for a while. And action photos between trains on the Everett line are extremely rare. So we'll take anything we can get, even a poor picture like this one. But this is in Duval, and this is what they call the High Iron Bridge over the Snoqualmie River. And this concrete pier still stands on the riverbank. You can see it from the present bridge. And then down here is the shingle mill. And then this was a warehouse. It was A.H. Boyd and Sons. And then you can see just a little bit of the roof of the Milwaukee Depot. And then this King Post here is where the Great Northern line came through before they abandoned. And they swung down here alongside the Milwaukee and then went under this overhead bridge that both railroads jointly put this up for traffic to be able to cross over the railroads above them and get down to the swing bridge in the county road. And then we got the town of Duval up here, and the Forest Inn, that was the pride of the town. It was a big Bavarian style hotel. They had a restaurant and a saloon in it and a pool room. Pretty fancy place for the little town. But the main thing of this photo is we got some train action here. We got a westbound log train, pretty good size. This must be an accumulation of logs that he's picked up at various spurs coming down from Cedar Falls. And then over here in the house track, we have an empty log train. And because the engine is facing backwards, I'm guessing that this is a Stillwater logger. And he's come from the Riverview log dump and he's taken some empties up to Stillwater. But this is kind of confusing because we have a high switch stand here on the house track switch. And normally these high switch stands were on the main line, and then they used a low switch stand for side tracks. And because they ran log trains on this line, they would lose a log or two occasionally. So once a year, they ran a cleanup train to pick up all the stray logs along the line. And of course, the logs are branded on the butts. So when these get down to the boom, they'll get them figured out and get them credited to the proper owners. And this is Duval again, the main line. And this is July 15th, 1932. And this is the High Iron Bridge again, what Milwaukee designated FF 908 1/4. There's the bridge marker plate there. But we can see the Milwaukee Depot over here and train order signal, the Continental Telegraph sign on it. And the agent at this time was a guy named Richard Percy Roselle. And he first worked for the Milwaukee Road as an agent at Beverly when they opened that depot up in 1909. And ended up coming here to Duval, and he worked here until they closed this station. And then he bumped in on the station at Carnation and then stayed there until he retired. And behind we can see the A.H. Boyd and Sons warehouse. And this was the agent's residence down on the river, and then a coal and oil house here. But you may have noticed the stairway here going up the bridge. And so in 1918, when this bridge was built, the agent here then was a man named Stanley Burke. And he requested the stairway put up on the bridge because he had to take sacks of mail off the passenger train and take them up to the post office in Duval. And apparently he felt it was easier to go these stairs and go into town on the bridge rather than to trudge up the dirt road, which probably got pretty muddy and messy during the rainy season. And his wife, Mabel Burke, was the first woman mayor of the town of Duval. Now, the Great Northern went through this opening here, but their tracks are gone, but they got tracks down here for Lazarus, and he had a connection down in here somewhere. But he's out of business now, but if we zoom in here, we can see the stack for his little Shea locomotive that sat abandoned down here for several years before they scrapped it. Now there's a shingle mill here that has provided employment for the town. It ran night and day and employed about 40 people. And Milwaukee built a spur into it. But later, the shingle mill asked if they could lower this spur to make its use more practical as a log dump, because the shingle mill could use these shingle bolts like we see in the boom here, but they also had the capability to saw whole cedar logs into bolts. So the Milwaukee lowered that spur and put it in here, and then they had a log dump on it here, and they could just dump logs into the Snoqualmie River, and the current would take them down into their boom. But we see lift span here. The spur was so low that shingle bolts on the bull chain wouldn't clear. So they put a hinge in here with a box of gravel for a counterweight, and the span here would be tilted up in the air and allow the shingle bolts on the bull chain to clear. But when they wanted to come in and switch the mill, then somebody would walk up that span using the ties like stairs, and his body weight would bring that span down, and then they could lock it into place and come in and switch the spur. And then this was the loading spur next to the dry kiln here, where they could load the box cars with loads of shingles for destinations unknown. And that's exactly what they're doing right here, is loading up this car with shingle bundles, and they're using a pretty primitive wheelbarrow, but it seems to be getting the job done. And this is just the Duval station sign. I took this picture on September 30th, 1972, but a few years later, when the contractor was out here tearing the line up, I talked him out of those two signs. And they had a block system on the Everett line, a phone system that also worked off the same two wires as the telegraph. And they had crank phones where you did long and short to raise the party that you wanted. But this one's kind of interesting. Snoqualmie Powerhouse. That was the hydroelectric plant at Snoqualmie Falls. And so they supplied 100,000 volts to the substation up at Cedar Falls. So I figured they must have had a Milwaukee phone in there so they could get a hold of them real quick if they had an emergency or something. And so effective September 21st, 1970, the Milwaukee Road started running what they called their Bellingham trains 361 and 362. And through the Burlington Northern merger, they won these rights to start running their own trains all the way up to Bellingham. So these trains were routed out of Tacoma and up to Cedar Falls, and then down the Everett line here to Monroe, and then over Burlington Northern to Everett, and then from North Everett up to Bellingham on the Burlington Northern coastline. And so this is the train orders for the first night of operation for the first Bellingham train out of Tacoma. And that same night, they ran the last Everett local up to Cedar Falls, and then they abolished the Everett local. And on this order, the Everett local and the first Bellingham train met at North Bend on this train order here. And they they ran a train from each end daily. The one would leave Tacoma and the other leave Bellingham. And the meets were usually, they were scheduled to meet at Cedar Falls, but if one was earlier, one was late, then they would meet at either North Bend or Carnation. So it was kind of exciting to have meets on the Everett line again. And this is a couple days earlier, the Everett local, on their run, they picked up 27 empty wood chip cars out of the siding at Carnation and moved them to Duval. And that was to open up that siding because they were anticipating the meets at North Bend and Carnation against those Bellingham trains. Now, on December 24th, 1970, train 362 hit a broken rail at the east house track switch and went on the ground here at Duval. And they rented a a crane out of Everett to help re-rail the engines. And there was a pair of U-33C engines, 8003 and 8000. And then here's one of those 90-ton steel wood chip cars, a couple of them. You can see the boom here for the Tacoma Wrecker and then the work train in the background. And here it is from a slightly different angle. You can see the little more of the wrecker and the work train here. But the carman up at Cedar Falls told me that he was down here on this wreck, and he said this guy tried to pick one of these locomotives up using just a single strand of cable. And he told him that was not going to work. And sure enough, the cable broke. And he said the boom came back against the crane so hard that it actually lifted some of the wheels off the ground. And he said he came so close to putting that crane into the river. And Butte Fennell was a brakeman, brakeman on the train when it derailed. And he said that from his seat, he could slide the side window open and put his arm out and touch the ground. And then Bob Stewart, the engineer, had just poured a cup of coffee out of his thermos when the engine went on the ground. And he said the coffee come out of the cup and just kind of hung in the air for a second and then spilled all over him. And but it made quite a mess. But 2 years later, on February 28th and 29th, the trains 361 and 362 were rerouted to run on the Burlington Northern via Woodinville and Snohomish Junction. And then at that time, they reinstated the Everett local back on between Everett and Cedar Falls. And they plowed up a lot of that fill material that we saw the little dinky engines spreading when they built the line. And this is just a page out of the 1927 station numbers book showing what stations and spurs were active at that time. And the Duval agency was closed out in June of 1936. And then they converted the depot to a section foreman's dwelling for a number of years. And then when they abolished the section, the depot was surplus, so they sold it. And so this photo was taken on Sunday, February 27, 1955, and they're moving the depot. The new owner jacked it up, turned it 180 degrees, and then set it over on pretty close to what was the old Great Northern right of way. And it sat down there below town for years like this. And then eventually he fixed it all up and made it into a community center. And had that for a few years. And then the depot got moved again because in September of 2002, he donated it to the city and they moved it up to what they call now Depot Park, which is next to the police station up there. And well, it sat down here neglected in below town. I rummaged around in the freight room and I found these books of ticket stubs. And so this was the first ticket sold out of here, ticket 0. And this was when the depot opened, January the 12th. Should be 1912, but he was still writing 11. And anyway, it's a ticket to toll for 30 cents. It was the first ticket sold out of there. And then here's a guy who was confused. He bought a ticket to O'Neill Gowan, which was a shingle mill north of Duval. Then he changed his mind and wanted to go to Novelty, south of Duval, but the fare was still the same, 10 cents. And then here's one to Othello for $5.55. And then this was a temporary station north of Duval called Cherry Valley, and this is where Cherry Valley Logging Company came down out of their woods and across a big long trestle and then down to the Snoqualmie River where they had a log dump down here. So when the Great Northern and the Milwaukee built through the valley, they crossed this logging river at grade. And then Great Northern put a spur in to connect to them. And so this is one of those occasions where the Milwaukee Road's showing a grade crossing with the Great Northern, with it's just a spur. And by late 1912 or early 1913, the Cherry Valley was out of here. They pulled up their equipment from this operation and moved down to Stillwater and joined up with the Stillwater Logging Railroad and became Cherry Valley Timber Company. And this is out near the King-Snohomish County line, but this is the Backus Spur. And H. Backus was a contractor that helped build the Milwaukee Road through the valley here. And he liked what he saw, so he bought some timberland up on the hillside. And then he built himself a sawmill. And he put in a flooring machine, and he could cut about 20,000 board feet a day. So Milwaukee Road put in this 310-foot spur track for him to load off of. And then you see the Gowan Mill spur here, and we'll cover that on a different map. There's a pretty good sized shingle mill here. You can still see where the kiln was on Cherry Creek. And the O'Neill brothers, Eugene and James O'Neill, were the president and vice president of Cherry Valley Logging Company. And James Gowan was the secretary for Cherry Valley. And Cherry Valley Logging Company logged for Weyerhaeuser. All their logs went to Everett to the Weyerhaeuser mill. And Weyerhaeuser didn't have a use for cedar. So when Cherry Valley would come to stands of cedar, they would either skip over them, or if they logged them, they just left the cedar on the ground to rot. And so these fellows thought that that was a kind of a terrible waste. So they built a shingle mill down here for $25,000 and had the capacity to cut 160,000 shingles a day. And so they put this mill in here about 1911, and Milwaukee Road and Great Northern tied into them. Now they had a dam about 2 miles up Cherry Creek, and they would put the shingle bolts in there. And when the reservoir got full, they'd open the dam, and then the shingle bolts all come down here and get caught in their boom. And so Great Northern put in a connection to them, and the Milwaukee tied into that. And then this was all on piling, and this part of the bridge here was built by the O'Neill Gowan people. And I saw field notes from a Milwaukee engineer that said that the O'Neill Gowan's portion of the spur was 1,096 feet long. It was 56 bents on 12-inch hewed caps, but bents 36 through 56 had no caps, the stringers resting on piles. So you got to wonder if the mainline logging roads maybe couldn't run their engines past bent 36 and had to use reachers to switch the spur. But the entire length of the spur was 1,445 feet long. And then it looks like they were going to put another spur in here. It was 1,488 feet long, but as far as I know, that one never got built. And this outfit was out of here by 1915. And a little further north, we come to the CB shingle mill. And W.R. Cunningham Jr. and George A. Bergstrom with the C and the B for this mill. And this was an early mill. They were out here in 1909 before the railroad, so they shipped their shingles on the barges by riverboat originally. And you can see some of their buildings were in the way of the Milwaukee Road when they came through, so they had to be moved. But they had a shingle bolt camp way up on the hill, and they sent the bolts down in a flume. They went down and put them in the river, and then they get caught in the mill's boom. But this flume was known to leak rather badly where it crossed the county road, and travelers had to give their horses an extra giddy up to get under there without getting soaked. But Milwaukee Road put a 290-foot spur track in here alongside the Everett and Cherry Valley Traction Company spur of the Great Northern. And in fact, they squeezed their spur in there so tightly that the shingle mill had to cut 9 feet off of their dry kiln to make a loading dock here. But Unfortunately, this mill caught fire and burned up in 1914, and they rebuilt, but they rebuilt their new mill down in Everett on the waterfront. But they prospered down there till the 1950s at least. And I was told that CB Shingle Company, they either invented a type of shingle or a method of applying shingles that was a standard in the industry. And now we're down to High Rock, and here's another big logging concern in the valley was the Stevensburg Lumber and Logging Company. And they logged clear up into the Lake Fontaine area, and their line come down here, and the original line swung out here and on ground level and went to a log dump on the Snoqualmie River. And so when the Milwaukee and Great Northern built their lines through the valley here, they initially had a grade crossing with the logging company uh, at these 2 points, but after a short time, they decided they didn't like that idea. So they jointly built a overhead bridge to put the logging railroad over the top of these two mainline railroads. And then about a year later, their logging railroad was called the High Rock Logging Company. And so High Rock wanted to start shipping logs by rail. So Milwaukee Road built this double track 44 span pile trestle as a transfer track, and then put some storage tracks up here in here to receive loads of logs. And then the two mainline railroads crossed at this point, and today Highway 203 is on the old Great Northern grade, and so where Highway 203 crosses the old Milwaukee grade is this point here. Now, if you go back in the weeds here a few yards, you'll find rails still spiked down to the tide, because this portion of the Everett Branch was left in all the way to Monroe Junction. And it's not continuous anymore. The rails have been pulled up at various road crossings. And then the bridge over the Skycomish River has been removed. But yeah, you wander out there in the weeds, you'll find rails still spiked down to the ties. And in this area here, Highway 203 goes through here, and then this side street is the 203rd Street. And presently, this is the site of a big, ugly roundabout. But here's the overhead trestle, and we see High Rock Logging Company with a shay down here and 7 loads of logs coming down off the grade. And then there's 7 loads of logs here in the transfer track. So that tells me that 7 loads is what this shay can handle down their grades. And then you see they put the empties on the side track. And then all this fill is brand new and clean. The railroads have just been built. And here's the Great Northern's Stevensburg Industry Spur, they called this. And then this was the old original route, and it had a connection to the Great Northern down over the hill. And then the county road went through here, and we can see a horse-drawn mail wagon down here. It says U.S. Mail RFD number 1. So I don't know if this gentleman is the mailman or if he's the superintendent for the logging company. But this is a view looking north, taken off of that overhead crossing. And in March of 1913, the Great Northern extended storage tracks and built some storage tracks in here so they could start taking log shipments from High Rock too. And they owned, Stevensburg owned a mill in Snohomish called the Cascade Mill. And so that's where these logs are going on the Great Northern. Now, the logs they interchanged to the Milwaukee Road, I don't know where those went. The Milwaukee must have served a mill, another mill that they owned or something. But this train here is a Stillwater logger. You can see it has the Tacoma Eastern log flats. And then it's got a Chicago, Milwaukee, and Puget Sound caboose. And they had about 50 of these, and they had these 7-digit numbers on them. But this guy's probably the conductor, and then his brakemen are up on the the roof. And this guy is so clear that you could identify him if you knew him. And then look up a little further here, and we see a guy standing on this log car, and then there's a guy leaning against the log car over here. And then if we run up to the head end, we can find the engine crew up on the cab. So this is obviously a train that's posed here for a publicity photo. And in the background, we can see a lot of barns and buildings. And there's the Tualco Schoolhouse, which is now a community center. And then down here is one of those triangular shaped Great Northern grade crossing signs. And then over here, we see a car parked on the side of the road, and that might be the photographer's car. In later years, High Rock just devolved into a 10-car spur. And I think the nearby correction center, Honor Farm, would get occasional carloads of hay and things like that for the farm here. But mostly this was just used for storage of unneeded cars. And here we see the obsolete wooden chip cars are in here, 273 940. And then you can see the signal bracket out there for the highway crossing lights, where 203 crossed the Milwaukee there. And halfway between High Rock and Monroe was the Redmond Smith mill spur. And this is as near as I can figure this one, the Redmond Smith spur is about milepost 38.7. And this was put in 1913, and they had a 1,475-foot main spur, and then a 380-foot side spur, and then a 200-foot spur alongside their sawmill. And then there's a bit of trestle work in here, but I imagine he shipped finished lumber out of here. But by mid-1916, he was gone. And then we come to the famous covered bridge over the Skykomish River. This was Bridge FF 962, and this is Roy Craig on his caboose. And when they were running over the Great Northern between Monroe and Lowell, they would often have to wait here for opposing trains. So they often would decide to eat their breakfast here while they had to wait anyway. And so that's what they're doing here. The locomotives are up at Monroe Junction, and the train is stretched out over here over the trestle. And here's the whole bridge. And it was 3 150-foot Howe truss spans. So the bridge was a total of 450 feet long. And it was supposed to be the longest covered bridge in the Western Hemisphere and the longest covered railroad bridge in the world. And we see the telegraph wires attached to little short cross arms attached to the side of the bridge. Now, the missing boards are courtesy of steelhead fishermen that are down here in the winter trying to stay warm. And the bridge even inspired local artist Bernie Weber to make a watercolor painting of it. And at the time of those photos, the configuration on the bridge from west to east was a 26-span pile trestle, and then 350-foot Howe trusses across the river. And then this section we're looking at here was 156 spans of pile trestle. And the bridge stretched all the way out to the Ben Howard Road. And then this was a approach signal that the Great Northern put in for Monroe Junction. It had just a steady amber light in it. And it was signal number 409. I can remember that from the Beach Boys song, She's Real Fine, My 409. But the reason for that number was the Great Northern didn't know which way the Milwaukee Road's mileposts ran. They just knew Monroe was at milepost 40. So 409 was translates into 40.9. And in reality, the the signal should have been 39.1, so 391. But there's no song about that. And at the east end of the bridge FF 962 was this 150-foot covered span over Haskell Slough. And the original bridge just went straight here. There was no curve to it, and then crossed over the Great Northern to get into Monroe. And you used to be able to see where that was because there was a gap in these trees, but they've all grown in since then, so you can't see it anymore. But this was the 1938 diversion where they built a line over to Woods Creek to connect to the Great Northern. And then in 1969, they removed the howe trusses and took them out and replaced them with steel. And it went from a 3-span howe truss bridge to a 4-span steel bridge. And the howe trusses were built in 1938, and this bridge was dates back to the 1890s. It came off of a abandoned branch line in Wisconsin somewhere. And then after abandonment, this bridge got damaged from various floods, and it got to a point where they finally removed all these steel spans in August of 2005. So there's no bridge left over the river here anymore. And here we see the Everett local poking out of the west end of the covered bridge, and you can see a bunch of wood chip cars there in the background. And these SD7s, the Milwaukee Road's nickname for them was stump pullers. And the 513 was the best stump puller of them all. For some reason, they had more pulling power than the other ones. So when they had the 513 on, they usually could make the hill from Tanner up to Cedar Falls without having to double the hill. And it just had that little extra pulling power, I guess. And here we see the train sitting at Monroe Junction, and they've probably gone to breakfast. And this train is sitting on the Woods Creek Bridge, which was Bridge FF 962 and 1/2. And the photo was made January the 19th, 1965. And you can see the rear unit out on the bridge. Now, this Woods Creek Bridge was removed about a year ago to clean up this stream for salmon habitation. And here we see the transfer. This was the old line going into Monroe. And in 1938, they changed it to a shorter route. So they put a new bridge across the Skycomish River. So they built 3 howe trusses over the river and abandoned all this. But this bridge was 4 trusses. It was 4 house span trusses. So this end truss was left in place. And then they put a pile trestle between here and the new trusses. And then with the Haskell Slough span on the other end of the bridge, for a time, this bridge had 3 separate howe truss coverings on it. But this one that they called span number 2, it caught fire and burned in October of 1946. And then the Haskell Slough span, it caught fire and burned up in September of 1953. And both of those howe truss spans were just replaced with pile trestle. And then down here, they had a short little bridge over Woods Creek, and this was FF 962 1/2. And here we are on the Great Northern Main Line looking east, and this is the westernmost end of Bridge FF 962, and then it went on to solid ground here. And there's a shingle mill up here on the hill that the Milwaukee served. And I believe this is what they call Milwaukee Hill, but I don't know that for sure. But I see the Great Northern has a spur in here, so I assume they somehow served that mill from down here. And here's a stairway going up to it. And here's a map of Monroe. We can get a look at their track layout there. They had a mill over here, this side of Woods Creek, that was called the Bucks Mill. And the Great Northern had a spur into it off of their line. So the Milwaukee wanted to tie into there and get some business too. So they built what they called the Bucks Mill Spur. And the entire spur was 2,182 feet long, but a lot of it was on trestle work. And so that was bridge FF 962A, and it was 89 spans and 1,405 feet long. And they put this spur in 1913, but by January 1921, that was all abandoned. And then up here they had another shingle mill, and this was owned by a guy named August Holmquist, so it was known as the Holmquist Mill Spur, but it was also called the Woods Creek Mill. And they put in a 525-foot spur track into that. And they put this in about 1913 too, but I think he was all done by 1916. And then in 1919, they put in this spur called Carew, but I don't know much about it other than it had something to do with the Florence Logging Company. And then they had this big trestle over Woods Creek, and it was bridge FF 964. And over Woods Creek itself, they had an 80-foot deck how truss span. So it was like the covered bridges, except it was below track instead of above it. And then that bridge continued down here and crossed Monroe's Main Street. And then we'll look at some of the yard trackage down here. Now, the Y was for turning the gas electric motor cars, but I kind of suspect maybe this short siding here was for running around the coaches when they had the steam shuttle service here. And then this 552-foot spur in here, I don't know what it was for, but I'm guessing it was like a public team track or something. And then you had this spur going into the Pacific Coast Condensed Milk Company, which later became the Carnation Condensery. And here's that chimney that's still standing out in the parking lot there. And then Great Northern served it on the opposite side. And I kind of suspect that maybe this track might be some remnant of the Great Northern's Cherry Valley branch. And then they had a spur here into the RJ Stretch warehouse. And then here's the Great Northern Depot and their water tank, and then the Milwaukee Depot and their water tank. And then you had a warehouse down here with a storage track, and then the passing track. And out of all the open stations on the line, Monroe had the shortest passing track of all of them. This track was put in 1917 when the Great Northern gave up their line and they ran over the Milwaukee Road between Tolt and Monroe. And so this was for them to get back onto their own rails here at Monroe. But later in 1936, when the Milwaukee started running over the Great Northern between here and Lowell, then they temporarily used this connection to get on and off before they got the tracks down there at Woods Creek put in. And then this was a spur called the Wagner and Wilson Lumberyard Spur. And the Wagner and Wilson had a sawmill off of their logging railroad, and then they had these spurs in here and a lumber shed and would load the lumber out of here. And both railroads served it. Days to turn their gas electric motor car when they wiped out their own Y here in Monroe. Great Northern in the background, and Milwaukee Road's water tank. There's that warehouse and storage track, and then there's a passing track and the line heading out towards Snohomish and Everett. And we can see a little bit of the gravel pit tracks here. And then going this direction, we can see the storage track comes in at this low switch stand. Passage track comes in at the high switch stand. And we can see Lewis Street comes right up to the depot here. And later they had to move this depot over here to allow Lewis Street to come all the way up to the new Highway 2. Now, Monroe Station, and ironically, the operator that board was a guy named Crawford Gordon. And then a guy named Ralph Cummings came in as a permanent agent and worked here a number of years. But then a few years later, Crawford Gordon bid in this job, and then he was the agent until the depot closed in 1940. And so he was the first and the last agent here. And here's the spur over to the RJ Stretch warehouse, and then this spur that went over to the condensery. And this is Monroe in 1914. And we can see the Bucks Mill spur here. And then where they swung in, and then the Great Northern spur coming into Bucks Mill. And there's the mill, and then there's our dry kilns in the back there. And then if we come over here, here's the August Holmquist shingle mill. And then his dry kilns are here. And then the Milwaukee spur comes in here, and then they've got a car on the end of the spur that they're loading. And then if we go up and look in the background here, we can see the Great Northern's Monroe Depot there, and then their water tank. And then over here is the Carnation Condensery, Carnation Milk, non-equal. And then there's the Milwaukee Monroe Depot, and then their water tank. But I see this work train working down here, and he's got a bunch of dump cars and it looks like a steam shovel. So they're either excavating or they're grading in here. And this looks to me like the spot where the Y was. So if they're excavating and putting in the Y for the gas electric car, then that would date this photo to be late 1912 instead of 1914. And here's the Monroe Depot about a year after it was closed. This is 1941. And they weren't running on these tracks regularly anymore, but they left them in and they called it the old main line. And there were a few customers still back here, but mainly it was for outfit cars when they had the bridge gangs in here working on the covered bridge. And you can see the water tanks been neglected. It's got no water in it, and the wood's drying out and shrinking, and the rings are falling off of it. And the Milwaukee's famous barber pole crossbucks. And then over here, you can see a house with a Great Northern logo on it. And that was the guy who ran the greenhouse here. Great Northern had a big greenhouse because they supplied flowers for the whole system out of here. And Great Northern had a lot of depots that had parks, and then they had flower beds, and then a lot of depots had flower boxes on the windows. They grew them all there. And this is the depot in later years. There was a civil engineering outfit in here called Cavassa and Associates. And then the freight house end had a hairdresser in there. And I think that hairdresser's still in there. But this end, I think now is like a tattoo parlor or something like that. I did a sandblasted cedar sign for them, and I put the Milwaukee Depot on there in the Milwaukee colors. And here's a map of the whole line between Monroe and Lowell. And here's the old route here and the connection and the gravel pit spur and Y. And then it looks like here they're going to build a connection over to Milwaukee's Poor Farm spur, the county Poor Farm. Must have still had business there because this dotted line is the Milwaukee line being abandoned. Out at Frylands, they had the C.H. Fry Company, had big lettuce farms out here. And so they shipped lettuce from packing plants off of this spur. Over on the Milwaukee Road side, they had Woodruff, which was the Three Lakes logging company, but it looks like they're out of here by now. But Milwaukee did get some uh, lettuce business on their old line too. That they had the J.G. Robinson spur here that would ship lettuce, and then Lettiston over here. And this was a place where uh, they received manure from the Carnation Farms and used it as fertilizer out there for their lettuce farms. Out here at French Creek, the Milwaukee Road diverted away from the Great Northern and went in here on the north side of the river, and then went under the Northern Pacific Sumas line, and then come in along the river and through the town of Snohomish, that route. Whereas the Great Northern, they crossed the Snohomish River on a drawbridge here and then came into Everett on the south side of the river. And then this is Bromart, where the Northern Pacific had a connection to get on the Great Northern to run their trains via Great Northern to get into Everett. And then the Milwaukee wandered out through here, and then they crossed Eby Slough on a drawbridge and went on to Eby Island. And they had two spur tracks off of the Everett line. And this was one of them. It was called the Eby Island line, and it ran for a mile and a half north here, and it served a mill on the river called the McWilliams and Henry Mill. And the spur was intended to extend up here and serve the Sumner Iron that portion of the spur never got built. And then when this mill shut down, the Eby Island spur was abandoned in November of 1916. And then the line continued down and crossed the Snohomish River on a drawbridge, and then there's this trestle work all the way across here. But they had a line that dropped down to ground level, and then that their other spur was called the Riverside line, and it went on this side of the river and went all the way up to what was then the Ferry Baker Mill, but up to Warehouser's Mill B. And later they abandoned portions of it and ran over the adjacent Northern Pacific line. And then the line continued up what they called the city line, and then went up to their engine facilities where they had a turntable and a service tank and fuel and things like that. And then the freight and passenger depot was up here on McDougal Street. And then the line continued up to, but did not cross Pacific Avenue. And a myriad of narrow gauge railroad that ran. And so this was a home built locomotive for the J.G. Robinson lettuce farms that was built by the Snohomish Iron Works. And this is photographer Ed Ham, and he's out on the Pilchuck River Bridge here, which was truss covering over the Pilchuck River, but he's taking his own picture here. He had a string running to the camera, and he could be in. And that was done in October and November of 1940 is when they pulled the rails up on this section of the line. And then here we see Ed again through the other end of the covered bridge. And then this here is up at Snohomish. And this is in 1935. They had a flood here. And we're up on top of the Northern Pacific's overhead bridge, which the Milwaukee called FF 990. And we're looking down on bridge FF 982 during a pretty bad removed from the railroad operations. And then this Milwaukee trestle work on the river from the river. There's the Milwaukee Depot up there. And then here's a map of Snohomish. And we can see that their trestle work on the river was laid out in a big lazy S pattern. And they had a spur off of that bridge. And on this map, it's called the Brewhar Spur, but it had many names over the years. It was originally the James Burton Spur in June of 1911. And then I guess it became the Brewhar Spur for a while. And then it was the Laundry Spur. And then it was used by Brune and Henry to unload hay and grain. But this this whole trestle was designated as Bridge FF 992. And the trestle here was Bridge FF 992A, and it was 185 feet long. And they had another whole business block here burned down in a bad fire. It damaged the Milwaukee trestle because the first real Milwaukee train that came to Snohomish was a workman to come out and do repair work on this trestle. So my thinking is that trestle spur got burned out in that fire, and since there was no business there now from the fire, there was no reason to rebuild the spur. So it only shows up on the initial survey plats. Anyway, and then here's the depot. It was 65 by 24 feet. And today it is the American Legion Post 96. And the Milwaukee had a house track coming into it, 487 feet long. They had a loading platform out here with a ramp on it. And then in here, they had raised platforms that they could spot boxcars in here and unload stuff to and from the depot's freight house from off of these raised platforms. And then they had a crossing watchman shanty here and a plank driveway to get to the Snohomish Iron Works and Lebanon Street. And then Brune and Henry spur here went to their stables. And then somewhere in here was that commercial hotel that I showed you the pictures of. And then they had a weird spur down here, and they called it the Logging Railroad's Engine House Track, 545 feet long, 16 spans of open deck pile bridge that was 279 feet long, so that would be this. But Snohomish Iron Works did repair work on damaged logging locomotives, like runaways or wrecks. And so this track was evidently put in there for them to do their repair work on logging locomotives. And so it had this engine shed that was 18 by 58 feet long. And then they had a pit track in here that was 4 foot by 3 foot by 98 feet long. And then on each side of it, they had a plank platform that was 6.5 feet wide by 98 feet long. And then up here was the passing track, and then the main line is in the middle, and then you have a storage track here. And then the section foreman's house was here. And then he had a chicken house and a chicken yard. And then out here was a double track bridge at the west end of the passing track, and then the section laborer's bunkhouse. And this was the city limits at the time. But out here at the west switch is where the present Highway 9 crosses the old Milwaukee grade. And here's the bridge in all its glory, Bridge FF 992. It was 79 spans of pile trestle, and it was 1,227 feet long. And we can see there's a boxcar up there on the Brewhar spur or the laundry spur or whatever it was being called at that time. And and there's the depot, the train order signal, and then there's the Avenue D bridge. And then this is kind of a funky looking picture, but it's two ends of a panoramic view that shows both ends of the Milwaukee Bridge at Snohomish. And in this one, in the fog, we can make out the Northern Pacific's overhead bridge. And then we can see on the Milwaukee Bridge, there's the switch for the Brewhar spur. And this one looks down on the bridge, and we can see some of the Snohomish Depot and then the train order signal, but mostly we can see the watchman's shack down there. And so they had a crossing watchman for the Avenue D street crossing there. And initially they had both a day watchman and a night watchman. But by November of 1916, they pulled off the night watchman's job and they just put a special instructions in the timetable for trains to come to a full stop at night and send the brakeman ahead to flag the crossing before they occupied it. But they had a crossing watchman here during the day, and his name was Patrick Gannon, but he was more commonly known as Pat the Watchman. And he had this little 6x6 shanty that he could get into out of the weather and wait for his trains to show up and flag the crossing there. And on April 1926, after 16 years of service, Pat the Watchman was replaced by a dead man in the middle of the street with a wigwag on it. And this is labeled Twilight on the Snohomish, but this is the Cascade Mill where those logs from High Rock on the Great Northern would go. And then you can see the depot and the train order signal silhouetted up there. But here's the trestle work, and I noticed there's no handrail or no railing on it. Every other picture I've seen of that bridge has got this hand or railing thing along the entire length of it. There's a water barrel platform. So I don't know if this picture was taken before the railing was built or if they've removed it for bridge work or something. But this is the abandoned depot in 1940. The rails have been pulled up. Train order signal still there, but what's not here is Pat the Watchman's shack has been picked up and moved. And then if we zoom in here, we'll see that they built a fence across the trestle. And I can only assume that's to keep nuts from driving out on the trestle with the cars, I guess. And then here's a last look at Snohomish here, the trestle work. And the depot there. See a bunch of milk cans on the platform. And here's a good view of the unloading ramp there with the ramp and then the elevated platforms around the depot. And then there's Pat the Watchman's shack. And now this is down in Lowell, and this is the Snohomish River crossing, and this is Bridge FF 1018, and it was a 240-foot through Howe swing span drawbridge. And it originally had a 90-foot Howe truss span over here, but that was later replaced with a 60-foot steel girder that we see here in this picture. And here's the bridge from the other side of the river. And there's the draw tender's cabin on the side of it there. And then this is a panorama view of Lowell that's very interesting. There's the Everett Pulp and Paper Company's mill. And then we zoom in, we see the Northern Pacific's drawbridge over the Snohomish River. And that was the Everett Snohomish Interurban, so it was electrified. And then here's the Milwaukee Road drawbridge over the Snohomish River. And then here we have the 90-foot Howe truss is in. And then this was all a continuation of trestle off of here. running across these flats. And so there was 84 spans of pile trestle here, and then two 72-foot pony trusses, one over the Northern Pacific and the other over the Great Northern, and then the line going up to the city line they called it. But if we take a look over here, we see that the Everett Snohomish Interurban also went up on an overhead bridge to get over the Northern Pacific and Great Northern, and then they took a hard bend and went back down to ground level here. And I was told during the Depression that this bridge out here on the flats was full of homeless people and hobos. They used plywood or whatever they could find and built themselves little apartments in here to live. And so there was quite a little Hooverville in there at one time. But here in the background, we can see the Milwaukee's Belt Yard all on brand new fill. And then from there went the Riverside line. And then over here is the Everett Lumber Company's mill and the Milwaukee Shingle Mill. And both of those were served by the Milwaukee Road on spurs. And then if we look in the background here, across the river, we can see parts of the E.B. Island spur over there. So yeah, this was an interesting photo. And here's those two pony trusses. This was the Northern Pacific's depot at Lowell, and then the Great Northern's main line here. And they also copied train orders for the Great Northern. So we have a Great Northern train order semaphore over here, which begs the question, did they have underground rods that ran to the depot so they could throw this signal from the office? Or more likely, did they have to go bounding down these stairs and cross this well-worn path and over this plank over the ditch and throw the signal from here, then run all the way back, copy the train order, and then repeat it out of breath? I guess I don't have enough going on in my life that I gotta think about things like that. Anyway, here's the Milwaukee Depot up on McDougal Street, and this was their freight and passenger station. And I took this picture in 1972 when I worked there. And this sign was out at Pacific Avenue to show the directions of how to get to the Milwaukee Depot. And this is out along McDougal Street, and this is a C2S class consolidation, 280, and it was built by Baldwin Locomotive Works in April of 1910 as the 377. It was renumbered 7126 in 1912, and then the 1277 in 1938. And it was retired in July 1953. But this was the fastest of all the consolidations and was nicknamed the Racehorse. And engineer Gene Griffin told me that he was fireman on this engine with Joe Conley. And coming out of Snohomish, heading towards Everett on the Great Northern, Joe decided to find out just how fast this engine was. So he opened the throttle up. And Gene said this thing got to bouncing so bad that the tallow pot and oil cans were jumping off of the shelf above the boiler head, and bolts were falling out of the ceiling. And he was just sure it was going to derail. And then Joe finally backed off on the throttle and shut her down. And this is also along McDougal Street. And this is a Class N2 superheated Malley, the 9605. And this Malley was built by Alco in October of 1912. And it was built as a 9105, which was a Lines East number. So it was evidently intended to work on Lines East, but they changed their mind right away, I guess, because it was shortly after that renumbered to 9605, which is a Lines West number. But I figured this photo was around 1917 or 1918, and they didn't start running Malleys on the Everett line until the 1940s. So I'm kind of thinking maybe that the USRA had something to do with running a Malley up here to see if they would work. And in 1951, they dieselized the Everett line using this EMD TR4A and B cow and calf unit 2006. And we see it sitting on the Everett turntable. And here's a train order for it, copied at Monroe for it to run up to Cedar Falls and back. And then here we see it leaving Cedar Falls. That's Rattlesnake Lake in the background and some of the company employee structures there. And then we see the Everett line is electrified. And it was electrified for about a mile so that electric motors could switch the what they call the sanitary track. But these locomotives were replaced in 1952 by the brand new SD7s that they were receiving. So they were only in service for about a year. And this is conductor Fred Deem, and he's up at Cedar Falls on one of the electric helper motors. But he was a long-time conductor on the Everett Branch. And so here we see him many years later, and he's retiring. He made his last run on June 1st, 1968. And they had a little party for him afterwards at the Everett Depot. So this is conductor Roy Craig here, and conductor H.B. Muir, and then conductor T.C. Harvey. And then this is brakeman Joe Gossard, who was a switchman in the Everett Yard when I knew him. And then engineer C.K. King Clover and conductor Ed Kittleson. And then this is Lawrence S. Red Griffin, and he was a long-time engineer on the Everett Branch. And Red gave me my very first cab ride in a Milwaukee locomotive, and it was in this very engine, the 511. And this is March 17th, 1962. And in the early 60s, they were had so much business, they were able to use 3 SD7s versus the usual 2 of them back to back. And we see the 511 again here. And then in the background is the SD9 532. And Red Griffin gave me a cab ride in this engine from Everett to Duval when I was only 16 years old. And then later, when I was an employee for the Milwaukee, I was relieving on the agency over at Port Angeles. And I got a cab ride in that same engine from Port Angeles to Port Townsend and back. And then the 514 was often paired with the 511. And I remember those ash can spark arresters when I was a kid, seeing them on all the Milwaukee engines. And then they fueled the engines here using an old steam tender. And they had it set on an elevated track so that it could gravity feed to fuel the engines. Now, March 1st, 1968, they replaced the SD7s and SD9s with these General Electric U33Cs. And we see one here up at the engine facility in Everett. And there's the fuel car on the raised track and then the open inspection pit. And the first night they ran these engines, this is a message from the local to take the Everett Switchers caboose as a rider caboose. And then they were supposed to stop at Carnation and pick up Frank Upton, who was the head of the motive power department, and party and take them up to Cedar Falls. And then here's their running order. And so they rode the train up there, and then Frank declared that the U33Cs were just fine for this line, even though Roadmaster Cecil Gilhard argued that they were too heavy for the 65-pound rail on the Everett line. Plus, they were using these 90 or 100-ton steel wood chip cars, and they just literally beat the Everett line to death with those. But it didn't matter anyway, because by February of 1973, Weyerhaeuser stopped shipping their wood chips via rail and started shipping them on trucks on the highway. And so when they lost the wood chip traffic, then there was no more reason to have an Everett local. They could handle everything else on the Bellingham trains. So February 9th, Everett Local made its last run up to Cedar Falls, and this is their running order I copied when I was the operator there at Everett. And the line sat idle for a few years, and then King County showed some interest in it. So they put together this tour of inspection. And so this is on April 22nd, 1975. And they got King County officials out here, and then they got the mayors from the towns of Duval, Carnation, and Falls City. And they ran this tour of inspection over the line with the intent to buy it to use this line as a rail trail. So this is the Milwaukee Superintendent's inspection car. It was a Chrysler Newport that was nicknamed the Black Maria. And then Roadmaster Cecil Gilhart's High Rail. And then they put most of the crowd in this trolley car T1. But this was the last official Milwaukee Road equipment to run over the Everett Branch. And then that following winter, the winter of 1975-76, they pulled the rails up and abandoned the line. And so that concludes my program. I know it was rather long, but I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned a few things, and I thank you for watching it.
Alan, that was an absolutely wonderful program. My gosh, there is a lot of information that we needed to cover today, and by golly, we did that. So, like I say, there just was a lot to cover there, and George grew a beard. This went on so long.
Yeah, it grew out to here, and I had to run to the bathroom and shave real quick.
There you go.
But let me tell you, man, it's when I look at those really old photos, like I said, I think on another of your programs, the clarity of those photos must be, I mean, are they 4x5s or are they glass plate negatives? I mean, whatever they are, when you zoom in on them and you can read, like you said, the Wells Fargo little signs and this and that, it's just amazing. And or you can read engine numbers, it just blows me away.
Yeah, they were probably originally on glass plate negatives, and I had copies of them, but they were very well done copies. And then from those, I scanned them at high resolution, and so
Yeah.
that's how we got the clarity. But
Another thing I learned, noticed just a few minutes ago, you showed that consolidation, the 1277.
uh,
Uh, there's two photos of it in a Northwest Rail Pictorial Volume 2.
oh, on the excursion down to
Yeah, and
down
the
to
funny thing
Morton.
is, when I look back through the index in the back, there's no mention of those two photos on page 118, but there is the Frank Kobe photo of 282688 on page 119. So I think somebody overlooked the index there when they were setting it up. But anyway, interesting stuff,
Yeah, that was
especially.
that big excursion. It was going to be the last run over the Tacoma Eastern before they took out that section through Alder for the
Oh, I
dam.
see. Uh-huh.
And Jim Fredrickson was on that excursion.
Oh,
And then there was somebody on there that took movie footage because one time at a Milwaukee gathering, Warren Wing played movie footage of that excursion, and it was in color too, color
Oh,
film.
wow. Well, so Alan, how this, I want to ask the question, how long did you work on this? But I would have to say it was like a life's work, wasn't it?
I've been interested in the Everett line since I was a kid, and so I've saved everything I could get out of it, and I had unofficial access to the engineering records up at Tacoma in the D Street Freight House. They had a side door that was unlocked during daylight hours, and so sometimes I would get off my shift at Kent and drive up there and sneak in the side door and go in and start rummaging through all the engineering files that they had stored down there in the freight house. And
How about how about the photos, especially the really are those from collections that you bought or how did you
well,
get or swap meets?
there's a couple of old-time photographers that lived up in the North Bend area, and I was friends with a guy who his father was a helper engineer out of Cedar Falls. And when that photographer was up there shooting pictures, he would order two prints for one for each of his sons. And so this guy had quite a scrapbook full of Milwaukee Road early day photos. And so I was able to copy his stuff. And then when he passed away, his son gave me the actual album. So then I ended up with the original photos. But and then other stuff I've collected from like the museum up there in North Bend has a lot of really old Milwaukee Road photos.
Oh, speaking of North Bend, now was that the Milwaukee Depot or the NP Depot?
That's all those were the Milwaukee Depot.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. Yeah. Well, that's kind of kind of apropos for them to take the Black River lever plant up there too to put in there that I
Yeah.
used. So that was pretty cool.
Yeah. I've seen that in the Snoqualmie Depot up there. Yeah. And yeah, I mean, we kind of, as rail fans, we kind of complained that there wasn't much photos of the Everett line. Rail fans didn't seem to uh, go up there. And one of the reasons because the Everett local was a night job and you'd have to be up there along the line in the early morning hours to catch it in daylight.
Yeah.
But I managed to scrape up 168 images for this
Good
video.
scraping.
Yeah, that's right. So we should probably bring this fun fest to a close. Alan Miller has been our guest today at a Cascade Rail Foundation presentation on the Milwaukee Road Everett Branch on November 3rd, 2025. And Alan, thank you. This is just wonderful. And George, George, wingman, extraordinaire right there for us. And Alan, we'll look forward to your next program on train orders or whatever you think is interesting. So again, thanks, and what a wonderful program. And at this point, I'm going to say going once, going twice. Okay. Jonathan Fisher, your host and moderator, saying so long for now, everybody.